The dust was the first and last thing. It was in her mouth when she woke, a fine, gritty powder on her tongue. It coated the tin plate she washed, settled in the seams of the calico dress she mended, and fogged the single glass pane of the cabin window. Clara was 21 years old, and for the last 3 of those years, since the cholera had taken her mother and a stray bullet had claimed her father, she had lived in the dust. Her uncle, Silas, was a man who seemed to generate his own grime. He lived under the control of the bottle in his hand and the cards in his pocket. Their small, sagging cabin sat on the edge of Last Chance, a settlement that was little more than a wound on the landscape, a gathering of desperate shacks and one saloon blistering under the New Mexico sun, just a stone's throw from the Arizona line. Clara was a quiet woman, not from a lack of spirit, but from a lifetime of learning that noise earned a cuff and opinions earned a backhand. Her practicality was a fortress. She knew, to the ounce, how much flour was left in the sack, and she knew to hide half of it under a loose floorboard before Silas went to town. She knew how to patch a boot with scraps of leather and how to make a broth from rabbit bones and desert herbs. She moved through their small, dark home with a silence that made her almost invisible, a pale ghost haunting the edges of her uncle's loud, ruinous life. He was gambling again. She knew the signs. He hadn't spoken a word to her in 2 days, and the small pouch of coins she had saved from selling mending work to the freighters was gone from its hiding place. On the 3rd day, he came home early, well before noon. This was wrong. He was sober, which was worse. His sobriety was a brittle, sharp-edged thing, far more dangerous than his drunken stumbling. "Get your shawl," he said, his voice flat. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the door, his fingers drumming on the warped wooden table. "Where are we going?" Clara asked, her voice low. She kept her hands busy, folding a piece of cloth. "Never show fear." "I've business. You're part of it." "Silas, I have the mending for Mr. Henderson." He moved faster than she expected. His hand cracked across her face, the force of it sending her stumbling back against the wall. The taste of blood filled her mouth, metallic and familiar. "You'll do as you're told. Girl," he spat. "Now, get the damn shawl." She did. Her cheek throbbed, a dull, hot fire. She followed him out into the blinding white sunlight, her eyes down. The saloon was quiet for this time of day, but the air was thick. 3 Apache men stood by the bar. They were not the half-starved beggars who sometimes came to trade skins. These men were hard, their faces unreadable, their bodies lean and wiry with muscle. They wore buckskin leggings and carried rifles, not just bows. An older man, his hair streaked with gray, seemed to be their leader. Silas pushed her forward. "This is her," he said to the leader. The Apache man looked at Clara. His eyes were black and bright, and he studied her not as a woman, but as one might study a horse or a rifle. He looked at her hands, her teeth, which he motioned for her to show, and her hair. He nodded once, a sharp, indifferent motion. "It is a deal," the leader said. His voice was a low rasp, his English broken but clear. "The debt is paid. We grant you passage. Your cattle are safe." Clara's blood went cold. She looked at Silas, her heart a stone in her chest. A truce exchange, livestock, protection, and her. She was the final piece of the bargain. He had not just gambled away their money. He had gambled her. "Silas," she whispered. It was the only sound she could make. "It's a good trade, Clara," her uncle said. And for the first time, he could not meet her gaze. He looked at the floor, at the sawdust stained with tobacco. "It's a hard life out here. This is a kindness. You'll be provided for." A kindness. The word was acid. The leader gestured to one of the younger warriors. Before Clara could move or scream or even think, the man had gripped her arm. She didn't fight. The practical part of her mind, the part that had survived 3 years with Silas, knew it was useless. To fight was to be hurt, To be silent was to endure. She was led out of the saloon, into the sun. The warrior had a length of rope, and with rough, impersonal movements, he tied it around her waist. The other end he looped around the pommel of his saddle. She was not to ride. She was to walk. She cast one last look back at the cabin, at the dusty street, at the man who was her only blood kin. Silas had already turned back to the bar. He was pouring himself a drink. The warrior mounted his horse and kicked its flanks. The rope snapped taut, pulling Clara into a stumbling walk. She did not look back again. She set her eyes on the ground, one foot in front of the other, and left the last 10 years of her life behind. They traveled for the rest of that day and all of the next. The land changed. The flat, dusty scrub of the settlement gave way to the high desert, a place of stunning, terrible beauty. The world became vast and empty. Great spires of red rock rose toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Canyons opened up in the earth, sudden and deep, their shadows hiding secrets she did not want to know. The wind was relentless. It never stopped. It pulled at her shawl, whipped her hair into a tangled mess, and stole the moisture from her skin and lips. The sun was a hammer. There was no shade. Save for the fleeting shadow of a cliff wall, the world was rocks, sand, and cactus. Fields of saguaro stood like silent, armed guardians, their arms raised to the sky. Clara was overwhelmed by the sheer, crushing remoteness of it. Back in Last Chance, she had felt trapped. Here, she felt erased. If she were to lie down and die, the wind and the buzzards would have her bones clean in a week, and the dust would cover her tracks as if she had never been. The warriors never spoke to her. They shared water, passing her the skin with the same indifference they showed their horses. They gave her a piece of hard, dried meat in the evening. She walked until her feet were raw, the thin soles of her boots worn through. When they stopped for the night, they simply left her tied to a low bush, like an animal. She slept on the cold, hard ground, the rope still at her waist. Late on the second day, they entered a box canyon. The walls rose high on 3 sides, protecting the small valley from the endless wind. It was a hidden place, a scar in the rock, and it was alive. This was their camp. Dozens of people moved among the brush and hide shelters, which they called wickiups. The air smelled of mesquite smoke, roasting meat, and the unfamiliar scent of pounded herbs. Children, naked and brown, stopped their games to stare at her, their black eyes wide. Women looked up from grinding corn or scraping hides, their faces hard and suspicious. Clara was untied from the horse and shoved toward the center of the camp, where a low fire burned. The warriors spoke to the gray-haired leader, who had ridden ahead of them. Elders gathered. She stood, her head bowed, her entire body shaking from exhaustion and fear. A ceremony was performed. It was not for her. Not really. It was for the tribe. The old leader chanted in a low, rhythmic voice. He marked her forehead with ash from the fire. He took her hand and pressed it against a carved stone, then did the same with his own. She was given a bitter, smoky tea to drink from a gourd. It was binding. It was final. Then the leader called a name. Dakota. A man stepped out of the shadows. He was young, perhaps only a few years older than her. He was tall for his people, with a lean, hard build. His black hair was long, held back by a simple leather band. He was known, she would learn later, for his quickness in a raid and his ferocious spirit in a fight. He was a warrior of growing reputation. But as he stood there, forced to look upon his new property, he did not look fierce. He looked uncomfortable. Dakota was quiet. His face was serious, his eyes dark and deep. He looked at her, and then, quickly, looked away. His jaw was tight. He gave a short, stiff nod to the elder. This was his duty. This was his price for the truce his band had secured. The elder spoke to him in their own tongue. Dakota listened, his expression unchanging. When the old man finished, Dakota turned. He did not grab her. He did not touch her. He simply gestured with his head for her to follow. The camp watched them go. She could feel the weight of their eyes, the women's in particular. Some looked with pity, some with sharp contempt. He led her to his lodge, his wickiup. It was larger than most, set against a flat wall of rock, and just beside it, 3 paces away, was a small, new-looking lean-to. It was barely a shelter, just a pile of brush and hide propped against the stone. He pointed to it. That was hers. He said nothing. He simply turned and disappeared into his own lodge. Clara sank to the dirt floor of the small shelter. She was given her own space. She was not being dragged into his bed. Not yet. She sat, her back against the rock, and watched the life of the camp move around her. She was an island, watched from all sides, but untouched. The tension was a physical thing, a heavy blanket that threatened to suffocate her. She waited for the sun to go down. Night fell like a curtain, black and total. The high desert stars were brilliant, cold, and impost too. The campfires burned down to embers. The sounds of talking and laughter faded, replaced by the howl of a distant coyote and the constant whisper of the wind. She sat in her shelter, her knees drawn to her chest, every muscle tensed. She was waiting for the inevitable. Her uncle had sold her. The Apaches had bought her. Now, the payment was due. The flap of Dakota's lodge moved. He stepped out. Clara's heart stopped. Her breath caught in her throat. She closed her eyes, her hands knotting in the fabric of her skirt. She braced herself. She thought of Silas, of the rough, drunken men in the saloon, of the blows and the crude words. She braced for the weight of him, the pain, the tearing, the humiliation. This was it. She heard his footsteps on the hard-packed earth. He stopped in front of her small shelter. She waited. 1 second. 2. She heard him move again. He was setting something down. Slowly, fighting the terror that locked her limbs. She opened her eyes. He was not coming in. He was standing just outside. His face was in shadow, unreadable. He held out a water skin. She looked at it, confused. He nudged it forward. She took it, her fingers trembling so badly she could barely grip the leather. Then he stepped back. He had 2 thick, heavy fur blankets in his other arm, buffalo hides, rich and dark. He bent and laid them gently on the ground at the entrance to her shelter. He looked at her for one long moment. His expression was hidden, but she could feel the rigid tension in his body. He seemed to be fighting a war with himself. Then, without a single word, he turned. He walked back to his own lodge. He picked up a single, thin blanket, and he lay down on the cold, bare ground outside his own door. He lay on the floor, facing her shelter, as if standing guard, and he did not move. Clara stared. The water skin was heavy in her lap. The furs were piled at her feet, and her husband, the man who owned her, was sleeping on the dirt. The silence of the canyon was absolute. She watched him, a dark shape in the starlight. He did not stir. He was not coming for her. He was not going to hurt her. A sound broke from her throat, a small, choked sob that was more animal than human. The rope of fear that had been strangling her for 2 days did not just loosen, it snapped. But what flooded in to replace it was not relief. It was a dizzying, terrifying confusion. He had every right, by her uncle's law, by the law of this trade. Her body was the price, and he had given her water. He had given her blankets. He had left her untouched. A tear slid down her cheek, hot and stinging in the cold night air. Then another and another. She pulled the heavy, warm furs into her shelter, wrapping them around her shaking body. She buried her face in the dark, musky hide, and wept. She wept silently, her shoulders shuddering with the force of it. She was not weeping from fear, not entirely. She was weeping because, for the first time in her 21 years, She did not know what to feel. The absence of violence was so sudden, so profound. It felt like its own kind of blow. She was alive. She was unharmed. And she was more lost than she had ever been. Across the few feet of dark, cold ground, Dakota lay rigid as a stone. His eyes were wide open, staring at the brush wall of her shelter. He was not asleep, and he would not be for many hours. The night air was chill, but a line of sweat traced its way down his temple. He had heard her small, choked sound. He heard the rustle of the furs as she pulled them in. He heard the broken, silent rhythm of her weeping. Every muscle in his body was drawn taut. He was a warrior. He had faced settlers with rifles. He had hunted the mountain lion. He knew what to do with an enemy. He had no idea what to do with her. He had not asked for this. He had not wanted a white woman, a ghost skin, a reminder of the people who were pushing his own from the land. The elders had insisted. It was for peace. It was his duty. He did not know the custom for this. He did not know the words for this. He only knew the deep, burning shame of the transaction, and a sharp, unfamiliar ache that twisted in his gut. He closed his fists, his nails biting into his palms. He tried to will his breathing to be quiet, to be steady. He tried not to smell the faint, foreign scent of lye soap and fear and sorrow that had come with her into his camp. The emotional pressure was a thick, unspoken thing, heavier than the blackness of the canyon. He lay awake all night, sweating, and did not, even once, allow himself to look at her again. The sun rose clear and hard, a merciless eye in a pale sky. Clara woke stiff and cold. The heavy furs clutched around her. For a long moment, she did not know where she was. The smell of dust and strange herbs, the rough texture of the hide, the cold stone at her back, it all rushed in at once. Silas, the trade, the canyon, Dakota. She looked out of her small shelter. He was gone. The thin blanket he had used was gone, but the 2 buffalo hides he had given her remained, a silent, heavy testament to the night's strangeness. She felt a phantom ache in her cheek from her uncle's blow, a lifetime ago. The camp was already moving. Women walked past her, their faces averted, carrying water skins or bundles of wood. No one spoke to her. No one looked at her. She was a ghost, a pale, unwelcome specter in their world of brown skin and black hair. She did not know the rules. She did not know what was expected. She only knew the raw, gnawing fear of the unknown. After an hour of sitting, invisible and terrified, an older woman approached. Her face was a map of deep lines, her eyes sharp and assessing. She was the wife of the elder who had performed the ceremony. She stopped, looked at Clara with an expression that was neither kind nor cruel, but simply impatient. She thrust a heavy, empty water skin at her, then pointed toward a narrow gap in the canyon wall where a thin trail led upward. Clara understood. She scrambled to her feet, her limbs aching, and took the skin. She followed the trail, her worn boots slipping on the loose rock. The spring was a small, green miracle, a trickle of clear water sea-meeping from the red stone, collecting in a shallow, sandy pool. Other women were already there, filling their own skins. They ignored her, their conversation, a rapid flow of guttural sounds and sharp clicks, continuing as if she were not there. She struggled with the skin, her hands fumbling with the stopper. The water was cold, shockingly so. The full skin was heavy, at least 40 pounds. She staggered under the weight, her shoulders burning as she made her way back down the trail. When she returned, the old woman was waiting. She grunted, took the skin, and then pointed to a pile of mesquite branches, firewood. Clara's day began. It was a life of unending labor. She hauled water. She gathered wood. She was given a heavy, smooth stone and a slab of rock and shown how to grind the dried, hard kernels of corn into coarse meal. The work was brutal, harder than anything she had endured with Silas. Her hands, already calloused from mending, were rubbed raw. She burned her fingers trying to move heated rocks for cooking. She cut her palm on a sharp yucca fiber she was meant to be stripping. The women watched her. Their eyes were a constant weight. Some held open contempt, muttering to each other and laughing when she stumbled. Others looked at her with a flat, distant pity, the way one might look at a lame horse. Dakota was not there. He left before dawn with the other hunters and did not return until dusk. When he did, he would eat alone, his back to her, before taking a single blanket to his place on the ground outside his lodge. He never spoke. He never looked at her. But he saw. One afternoon, a sharp-featured woman, who seemed to take particular pleasure in Clara's misery, motioned for her to pick up a massive bundle of firewood, far larger than any of the others. Clara tried, her knees buckling under the weight. She could not lift it. The woman barked a word at her, shoving her. A shadow fell over them. Dakota was there. He had returned early. He did not say a word. He simply walked to the pile, his face hard as granite. He looked at the sharp-featured woman, his black eyes flat and cold. She visibly recoiled, her mocking expression dissolving into fear. Dakota bent, separated the bundle into two smaller loads, and slung one over his own shoulder. He gestured to the other, smaller pile. For her. Then he walked away, carrying the wood to their lodges. He had not defended her, not in the way a white man might, with words. He had simply balanced the scales. He would not allow her to be treated as less than he was. He insisted she eat when he ate. He saw that she had her own portion of the rabbit stew, that she had her own cup for water. It was a strange, silent protection. He refused to treat her as property, but he also refused to treat her as a wife. She was his responsibility. This gentle, distant leadership was more confusing than cruelty would have been. Cruelty was a language she understood. This silent respect was foreign. Clara was a practical woman. Fear gave way to the need for survival. She began to watch, to listen. She was determined not to be a burden. She learned to ignore the stares, the muttered words. She focused on the tasks. Her hands hardened. The blisters became calloused. She learned to anticipate the way the grinding stone skipped, to balance the water skin on her hip. She learned to find the dry, dead wood instead of the green. Slowly, almost imperfectly, something shifted. The old woman, the elder's wife, saw Clara struggling to weave a mat from dried grasses, her fingers clumsy and thick. The woman watched for a long time, her expression sour. Then, with an exasperated sigh, she knelt beside Clara, seized her hands, and repositioned them, her rough fingers guiding Clara's, showing her the motion of the weave. She barked a word, "Ditzas," thin, another, "Inteliz," tight. Clara repeated them, "Ditzos, inteliz." The old woman grunted, almost a sign of approval, and left. Clara held the words. She learned others. Tu was water, ko was fire, chill was the plant she gathered. She learned that a sharp, high sound meant yes, and a low grunt meant no. She learned ahehi, thank you. She whispered it to the old woman one day when she was given a piece of roasted meat. The woman merely stared at her, but she did not scold her. The learning was slow. She cut her fingers. She burned her arm, but she persisted. She was no longer a ghost. She was a clumsy, silent, and very pale shadow, but she was there. The delicate, unspoken truce was shattered one evening. The hunters had been successful. A deer had been brought in, and with it, a skin full of tiswin, a fermented drink made from corn. The mood in the camp was lighter, louder, but to Clara, the sound of men drinking was a prelude to violence. She stayed in her shelter, her back to the rock, her hands clenched. Late in the night, she heard a stumble, a muttered curse in the Apache tongue. A man loomed in the opening of her lean-to. It was not Dakota. It was a man she recognized, a warrior named Zako. He was broad, with a cruel mouth and eyes that were often clouded with drink. He was drunk now, his breath sour, his body swaying. He saw her and grinned, a gap-toothed, predatory expression. He said something, his voice thick. He reached for her. Clara scrambled back, pressing herself into the rock. "No," she whispered. "Please." He did not understand her word, but he understood her terror. It only excited him. He lunged, grabbing the front of her dress, his other hand fumbling with his leggings. She cried out, a high, thin sound, as he pulled her forward, his weight falling on her. It was over in a second. A shape moved from the darkness, impossibly fast. Zako was ripped off her as if by a whirlwind. It was Dakota. His face was not the quiet, serious mask she knew. It was something else. It was a mask of pure, cold rage, his eyes black and empty. He did not shout. He did not speak. He hit Zako in the throat, a hard, short blow that made the drunken man gag. As Zako staggered, Dakota kicked his knee, the sound of bone and cartilage tearing loud in the sudden silence of the camp. Zako howled, falling to the ground. Dakota did not stop. He fell on the man, his fists rising and falling. It was not a fight. It was a beating. It was brutal and systematic. The sound of his bare hands hitting flesh and bone was heavy and wet. He beat Zako until the man was a bloody, unmoving heap on the ground. People were shouting. The elder leader was there, pulling at Dakota's arm, shouting his name. Other warriors dragged him off the broken man. Dakota stood, his chest heaving, his body slick with sweat. His knuckles were raw and bleeding. He looked at Zako, who was groaning, barely conscious. Then, slowly, he raised his head, and his eyes found Clara, who was huddled by the rock, her dress torn, her hand over her mouth. She saw it then, in the wild, ragged flash of his eyes. It was not just anger at a broken rule. It was not just the defense of his property. It was something deeper, something fiercely personal. It was a raw, possessive fire. It was a look that said, "Mine to protect, mine to touch, mine." Then, as quickly as it came, it was gone. His eyes cleared. He saw her looking at him, and the fire vanished, replaced by a wave of something dark and heavy. He looked at his own bloody hands as if he had never seen them. He turned, pushing past the elder, and stalked away into the darkness at the edge of the canyon. Zako was dragged away by his kin. The camp fell into a heavy, watchful silence. Clara waited. He did not return. She finally crept back into her shelter, pulling the hides around her, but she did not sleep. She found him just after dawn. He was sitting on a ledge high up the canyon wall, staring out at the desert. He had not slept. He had not cleaned the blood from his hands. She watched him from a distance. He was sitting with his back to her, his shoulders rigid. The shame was rolling off him, a tangible thing, a dark cloud. He was a man who had been called soft, who had fought to prove his strength, and who had just shown a violence that was almost uncontrollable. He was ashamed of the violence, or ashamed that she had seen it. She did not know. She went back to the camp. She found a small gourd, filled it with water from the spring. She tore a strip of cloth from her already ruined petticoat. Then, her heart hammering against her ribs, she climbed the trail to his ledge. He heard her approach but did not turn. She stopped a few feet behind him. He was motionless. Slowly, she walked to him and knelt in the dust in front of him. He flinched, turning his head away, his jaw tight. He would not look at her. "Let me," she whispered. Her voice was a dry croak. She reached for his hand. He snatched it back, pulling it to his chest. "No," he said. The word was a growl. "They are bad," she said, nodding at his split, bloody knuckles. She held out the water and the cloth. He stared at her, his expression a storm of confusion, anger, and a deep, mortifying shame. He said nothing, but he did not pull away when she reached for him again, more firmly this time. His hand was large, rough, and stained. Gently, so gently. She poured a little water over his knuckles, washing away the grit and the dried blood. He hissed as the water hit the raw flesh, but he held still. She dabbed at the cuts, her touch as light as she could make it. He was trembling. Or maybe she was. She wrapped the clean cloth around his right hand, her fingers brushing his calloused palm. She did the same for the left. It was a clumsy bandage, but it was clean. The silence was immense. It was just the two of them on the high ledge, the wind whispering around them. When she was finished, she stayed kneeling for a moment, her hands in her lap. He was still looking away, at the vast red expanse of the desert, but his breathing was rough. Clara stood, turned, and walked back down the trail, leaving him alone with his shame. Several nights passed. The camp was quiet, the people wary. Zako was recovering, but he would walk with a limp. And he did not look at either of them. Tekota's mood was darker, more distant than ever. He still slept on the ground, but he seemed even further away, lost in his own thoughts. One night, Clara lay awake in her shelter. The moon was a bright sliver, casting a pale, ghostly light into the canyon. She could see Tekota's form, a dark shape wrapped in a blanket, absolutely still. He looked lonely. She did not know why she did it. It was an impulse, a strange, quiet pull she could not name. She rose from her furs, her bare feet silent on the cold earth. She crept the few paces that separated them and knelt beside him. He was asleep, or pretending to be. His breathing was deep and even. His hair was loose, fanned out on his blanket. It was black and thick. She lifted her hand, her fingers trembling. She was terrified. He was a man who had nearly killed another for touching her. What would he do to her for touching him? But the impulse was stronger than her fear. She let her fingers drift down and lightly, so lightly, she touched a lock of his hair. It was softer than she expected. He stirred. His entire body tensed. His breathing stopped for a heartbeat, but he did not open his eyes. He did not move. He did not stop her. She held her breath, her hand hovering over him. Then, her courage failing, she snatched her hand back and fled to her shelter, her heart pounding a frantic, wild rhythm against her ribs. The next day, the sky turned a sick, sulphurous yellow. The air grew still and heavy, the wind dying to an oppressive whisper. The camp became agitated, the women working quickly, securing the lodges, gathering the children. "Sky dust," the old woman said to Clara, pointing at the yellow haze. It came without warning. A low moan grew to a deafening roar, and a solid wall of brown dust, 1,000 feet high, rolled into the canyon. The world vanished. "Here!" Tekota's voice. He grabbed her arm, his grip iron, pulling her from her shelter. It was the first time he had ever truly held her. He dragged her toward the cliff wall, to a shallow fissure in the rock, barely a cave. He shoved her inside, into the dark, and then pressed in behind her, his body shielding the entrance as the storm hit. The sound was a physical blow, a continuous deafening shriek that seemed to come from inside her own head. The air was thick, choking. She coughed, pressing her torn sleeve to her mouth. Dust seeped in, a fine, gritty powder that coated everything in seconds. They were trapped. For hours. The storm raged, a living, screaming thing trying to tear the mountains apart. They sat in the pitch black, huddled together. His shoulder was pressed against hers, his leg against her hip. The forced proximity was a suffocating, intimate thing. She could feel the heat of him, the solid, tense muscle of his body. Finally, the roar subsided, fading to a low, mournful howl. But the air was still too thick to breathe, the world outside still invisible. They could not leave. The silence in the small, dark shelter was heavier than the storm had been. Clara broke it. Her voice was a dry rasp. "Why?" She felt him turn his head in the dark. Why, what? His English was slow, halting. Your hands, she whispered. That night? Why? He was silent for so long she thought he would not answer. He shamed you, he said finally, his voice a low rumble. He shamed me. He touched what was not his. I am used to it. The words fell out of her before she could stop them. A bitter, terrible admission. She felt his body tense beside her. I am not, he said. Another long silence. Then he spoke again, his voice lower, rougher. My name, Dakota. It means friend to all. My mother's name for me. He paused, and when he spoke again, the word was spat, like poison. Nintalis. What is that? She asked. Soft, he said. The girl, Chiala, I wanted her. She laughed. She said I was soft, not a warrior, not a man. She wanted Zako. The admission hung in the dusty air. Zako, the man he had beaten. So, he continued, his voice flat, I became not soft. I went on raids, I fought, I took the scalp, I showed I was a warrior. He shifted, his shoulder brushing hers. But it is still here. He tapped his own chest. The laugh, the name, still unwanted. His confession broke something deep inside her. The story of a woman's laugh, a simple rejection. It seemed so small, yet it had shaped his entire life. She found herself speaking, her voice hollow in the dark. My uncle, she said, after my parents died. He drank. He hit me. When he lost at cards, he hit me. She was shaking. He sold me for cattle, so the Apache would not take his cattle. I was the price. She pulled her knees to her chest. I was just a thing, like a sack of flour, like a worn-out boot. I do not think any man sees a woman. They just see a thing to own, a thing to use. Her voice cracked. A single hot tear escaped, tracing a clean path through the grit on her cheek. She scrubbed at it, angry at her own weakness. I am sorry. No, he said. The word was rough, sharp. She felt him move beside her. A hand, large and warm, came up. It hovered in the darkness between them, trembling. He did not touch her, not at first. His fingers traced the line of her jaw, a hair's breadth from her skin. Then, so gently she almost gasped, he cupped her face, his thumb, calloused and rough, brushed the tear from her cheek. Clara stopped breathing. Her eyes were wide in the blackness. No one had ever touched her with such care. Not her mother, not her father, not in her entire life. It was not a touch of ownership or lust. It was something else. Wonder. Hesitation. His own breath was ragged. He held her face for one long, stretching second. 2, 3. The contact was a spark in the dark. She could feel the violent tremor in his hand. He was terrified. Suddenly, as if he had been burned by a hot coal, he snatched his hand back. He turned his head, pressing his forehead against the cold rock of the cave. She heard him draw a sharp, shaking breath. He said nothing more. The storm howled outside, a distant, lonely sound, but the silence inside the cave was absolute. A living thing, charged and breathless and new. When they crawled out of the rock shelter, the world was new. The storm had passed, leaving the air scoured and cold. The sky was a pale, washed-out blue, and a thick layer of fine brown dust coated every rock and cactus, muffling all sound. The canyon looked like a painting that had been scrubbed too hard. The intimacy of the dark, the shared confessions, evaporated in the bright, cold light. Dakota would not meet her gaze. He was distant, his face carved from the same hard granite as the cliffs. But the quality of his silence had changed. It was no longer the discomfort of a stranger. It was the intense, vibrating awareness of a man who was now, against all his training, acutely aware of the woman beside him. The dust storm was an omen. The scouts who had been sent out returned 2 days later, their faces grim. They had not seen cavalry, but they had seen something just as final. Surveyors, white men with tripods and measuring chains, mapping the land. Behind them, always, came the wagons, the rifles, and the fences. The elder, Cochine, called a council. The decision was swift. They would move. The camp was struck in a matter of hours. A frantic, organized migration. They would go north, into the high country, the fortress of the mountains, where the air was thin and the passages were known only to them. Clara was not tied to a horse. She was not expected to walk. Nalin, the old woman who had become her reluctant teacher, motioned her toward a shaggy, placid mare. There was no saddle, only a worn blanket. Clara, who had ridden only a handful of times in her life, pulled herself onto the horse's back. The journey was grueling. They left the Red Rock Desert behind. Climbing steadily, the land changed. The sparse, thorny scrub gave way to juniper and twisted pinon pine. The air grew thin and cold, biting at her exposed skin. Clara was clumsy on the horse, her balance poor, her muscles screaming from the unfamiliar posture. She fell twice, tumbling into the sharp gravel, earning a few sharp laughs from the other women. But she did not cry out. She gritted her teeth, ignored the burning scrapes on her hands, and pulled herself back onto the mare, her face set. She was stronger now. The weeks of hauling water, of grinding corn, of walking miles for firewood had hardened her body. Her hands were no longer the pale, soft hands of a mender. They were brown, calloused, and capable. She had learned to watch, to anticipate. Nalin had shown her which roots to dig for, how to find the small, sweet berries hidden in thorny brush, how to read the subtle signs of water. She was learning to survive in a land that was designed to kill. They made their new camp in a high valley, sheltered by towering pines and sheer walls of gray rock. It was beautiful, but it was cold. The wind was a constant howling voice that swept down from the ridges. At night, the temperature plummeted. For the first time, Clara saw snow, a fine dusting of white on the highest peaks, glowing like bone in the moonlight. Survival here was a different kind of battle. The cold was a constant, aching presence. Her small brush lean-to, adequate in the warm desert, was useless here. The wind sliced through it as if it were not there. The first night in the new camp, she huddled under her 2 buffalo hides, her body shaking in violent, uncontrollable tremors. She clamped her jaw shut to keep her teeth from chattering. She saw Dakota watching her. He was still sleeping on the ground outside his own lodge, his single blanket a thin defense against the punishing cold. His pride was a wall as high as the cliffs around them, but she could see him shivering. The second night, a hard frost settled. The water in the skins turned to slush. Clara felt the cold seep into her bones, a deep, paralyzing ache. She knew, with the practical certainty that had kept her alive, that she could not survive many nights like this. She watched him. He stood by the flap of his wickiup, his back to her, a rigid silhouette against the faint glow of the camp's embers. He was arguing with himself. She could see the tension in his shoulders. He was caught between his pride, his duty, and the simple, animal fact of the cold. Finally, he turned. He stalked over to her small, pathetic shelter. He did not speak. He did not ask. He bent, and with one swift motion, he gathered her and her heavy buffalo hides in his arms. She gave a small, startled cry. He lifted her as if she weighed nothing, turned, and carried her the few steps into his own lodge. He set her down on the dirt floor. The wickiup was dark, smelling of smoke, dried herbs, and the faint, musky scent of the man himself. It was warmer. The insulated walls of brush and hide broke the terrible wind. He laid his own bedroll on one side of the small, central fire pit, which held only cold ashes. Then he took her furs and laid them out on the other side. A space of at least 3 feet separated them. He was not inviting her to his bed. He was offering her shelter. He was bringing her inside. He lay down on his furs and turned his back to her. Clara's heart was a drum against her ribs. She crept into her own bedroll, pulling the hides up to her chin. The silence in the lodge was absolute, broken only by the howl of the wind outside. She was intensely aware of him, of his breathing, of the heat from his body, a faint warmth that just barely crossed the space between them. She lay awake, rigid, staring at the dark, domed ceiling. They slept like this for a week, separate, silent, together. They were 2 statues in the dark, close but untouched. The cold worsened. The wind became a shriek. One night, the frost was so bitter it felt as if the world was freezing solid. Clara curled into a tight ball, her hands tucked between her knees, but she could not get warm. She was shaking again, a deep, internal tremor. Across the darkness, she heard Dakota shift. He was cold, too. In the blackness, huddled deep under the furs, she instinctively sought warmth. Her hand moved, burrowing deeper into the hides. Her fingers brushed something. It was not fur, it was skin. It was his hand. She flinched, gasping, and started to pull away. His hand moved. It covered hers. His fingers, calloused and strong, closed gently around her own. She froze. He did not grasp her. He did not pull. He just held, his fingers laced with hers, palm to palm. It was a simple, profound connection, a small island of shared heat in the vast, freezing dark. He did not pull away. He let his hand stay on hers. She lay there, her breath caught in her throat. She could feel the steady, slow pulse in his wrist. He was awake. He was as still as she was. They did not speak. They did not move. They lay for hours, their hands clasped under the furs, listening to the wind rage outside. The world, which had been so large and terrifying, shrank to that single, warm point of contact. The fragile peace was broken by the encroaching world. A warrior, returning from a lone hunt, had seen a patrol of cavalry, miles to the south but moving north. They were not looking for a fight. Not yet, but they were a sign. The presence of the white men was like a slow-moving poison. Fear rippled through the camp, and fear needed a place to land. It landed on Clara. Cochine called a tribal council. This was not a discussion of scouts. This was a judgment. Clara was brought to the center of the camp to stand before the ring of elders and warriors. The firelight flickered on their hard, closed faces. Zako, the man Dakota had beaten, was there. He sat near the front, his leg twisted at an unnatural angle. He looked at Clara with pure, unadulterated hatred. An elder, a man whose face was a map of old scars, stood and spoke. He pointed at Clara. She was the white woman. She was a bad omen, since she had come. They had been driven from their homes. She was a beacon, drawing the soldiers, drawing the settlers. She would bring war. Another agreed. She was a poison. She was not Apache. If she stayed, she would weaken their blood. She would soften their warriors. She must be sent away, back to the white settlement, or perhaps just left in the wilderness. It did not matter. Clara stood, her hands clenched at her sides. She understood enough of the language now. They were debating her execution. She kept her back straight, her chin up. She would not show them her fear. They turned to Dakota. It was his right to speak. He was her keeper. Dakota rose. He stood for a moment, his eyes sweeping the circle. He was calm. The quiet, uncomfortable young man who had accepted her in trade was gone. This was a man who had made a decision. He looked at Cochine. She is not an omen, he said, his voice clear and carrying in the cold night air. She is a woman. She works harder than some. He glanced at Zako's kin. She does not complain. She honors our ways. She did not bring the soldiers. They were coming long before her. She is white, Zako spat, his voice thick with malice. She is not one of us. You have not even claimed her as a wife. A few men grunted in agreement. It was true. He slept near her, but he had not taken her. Takoda's eyes turned cold. He looked directly at Zako, then back at the elders. She is my wife, he declared. The words dropped into the silence, heavy as stones. Clara's head snapped up. She stared at him. The elders murmured. Kochine raised a hand for silence. You have not consummated the union. Takoda, she is not bound to you. She is not of your blood. She is my wife, Takoda repeated, his voice louder, resonant with a sudden, fierce conviction. She is my wife in spirit, and she is my wife in body. Clara gasped. A quiet, shocked sound. He was lying. He was lying to his entire tribe. For her, she is of my lodge, Takoda continued, his gaze unwavering. She is of my life. Her heart is Apache. Even if her skin is not, if you send her away, you send me away. I will go with her. The council was stunned. To banish Takoda, one of their strongest young warriors, was a terrible price, especially with soldiers near. He had drawn a line in the dirt. He had tied his fate to hers, publicly and irrevocably. Kochine, the old leader, studied Takoda for a long, long time. He saw the iron in his spine. Then he turned his gaze on Clara. He looked at her calloused hands, at the way her back was straight, at the absence of tears on her face. He saw the strength she had forged. He saw, perhaps, what Takoda saw. He nodded once, a slow, final motion. It is spoken. She stays. She is his. The council dissolved. The men walked away, muttering. Clara stood rooted to the spot, shaking so hard she thought her legs would collapse. He had saved her. He had claimed her. He had lied for her. He walked to her, his face grim. He gestured with his head toward their lodge. She followed him, her mind a whirlwind. Inside, the small space felt charged, the air thick enough to choke on. She turned to face him in the dim light of the low-burning fire. Why? She whispered. Her voice was trembling. You told them, It was the only word they would understand, he said. He sat on his bedroll, his back to her, his shoulders slumped. He looked exhausted. It was the only way. But to be banished, she said, stepping closer. You would leave your people. For me? He turned his head, looking at her over his shoulder. His eyes were dark, full of a new, raw emotion. I said it, he said, his voice low. It is true. You are of my lodge. I will not let them harm you. She stared at him, at this quiet, fierce man who had been called soft. He was the strongest man she had ever known. Stronger than her uncle, stronger than Zako, stronger than all the elders. His strength was in his restraint, in his quiet defense. Her heart felt as if it would burst from her chest. She moved to stand in front of him. He slowly raised his head to meet her gaze. Her lips were trembling. She had no words for what she felt. It was gratitude, but it was so much more. It was a deep, aching recognition. Hey, she whispered. Thank you. The small word was all she had. It held her fear, her relief, her stunned disbelief, her everything. He looked at her mouth as she spoke the word. He saw the gratitude in her eyes, but he also saw the fear and confusion. He saw her. He rose to his feet, so he was standing over her, slowly giving her every chance to retreat. He raised his hand. He touched her face, his calloused fingers tracing the line of her jaw, just as he had done in the dust storm. But this time, he did not pull back. His thumb brushed gently across her lower lip. Her breath hitched in her throat. He leaned in, It was agonizingly slow. She could see the fear in his own eyes. He was as uncertain as she was. He was terrified of frightening her, of becoming the man he had beaten, the man who had sold her. He kissed her. It was not a kiss of passion or of ownership. It was a kiss of reverence. His lips were soft, warm, and dry. They pressed against hers with a tenderness that was so profound. It undid her. It was a question, a plea, a promise, all in one. No one had ever kissed her like this. No one had ever touched her with such wondering, hesitant care. She did move. She just received it, her hands finding his chest, feeling the frantic, wild hammering of his heart beneath her palms. It matched her own. He gave a low sigh, a sound that seemed to be pulled from the deepest part of him, and the kiss deepened. It was still gentle, but there was a new weight to it. His other hand came up, sliding into her hair, his fingers tangling in the messy strands. He tilted her head, and his mouth moved over hers, learning her. A small, broken sound escaped her throat, and the change was instant. The reverence was consumed by a sudden, desperate fire. The weeks of shared space, of silent awareness, of their joined hands in the dark. It all burst forth. The kiss turned heated, sharp, and hungry. He pulled her hard against him, his body rigid, and his mouth became demanding. She gasped into his mouth, shocked by the suddenness of it, the raw hunger. And just as quickly, he tore himself away from her. He staggered back, his breath coming in harsh, ragged gasps. His eyes were wide, panicked. He looked at her swollen lips and dazed expression. And then he looked at his own hands as if they had betrayed him. He looked horrified. I am sorry, he choked out, backing toward the lodge flap. I did not. No, she whispered. She was breathless, her body trembling. Dakota, He held up a hand, silencing her. His entire body was shaking with the force of his restraint. No, he said, his voice rough. I will not be him. I will not be Zako. I will not be your uncle. I will not take. He was struggling, fighting for control, fighting for the English words. I will not, he said, his voice fierce. Not unless you ask me. Clara stared at him. The words hung in the lodge, more powerful than the kiss, more powerful than the council's decree. Not unless you ask me. He was giving her the one thing she had never possessed in her entire life, a choice, the right to her own body, the right to say yes, the absolute, respected right to say no. She was breathless. Her mind was reeling. She did not know what she wanted. The power of that choice, the respect inherent in it, was so stunning it left her speechless. She looked at him, at his vulnerability, at his fierce, agonizing self-control. She could not find the words. She said nothing. He saw her silence. He mistook it for fear. He saw it as a rejection, a confirmation that he had pushed too far, that he had become the animal he despised. A shadow of his old shame crossed his face. He nodded, a sharp, stiff motion. I will sleep outside, he whispered. Before she could speak, he turned and was gone, leaving the lodge flap swinging in the cold night air. Clara sank onto her furs, her hand pressed to her mouth. Her lips were still burning, and in her chest, her heart ached with a new, terrifying, and wonderful pain. The next morning was a quiet torment. Dakota's face was a mask of remote shame. He avoided her eyes. He took his bow and quiver, joining the other hunters, his limp from Zako's attack still noticeable. He was gone before the sun had fully risen, his departure a relief and an ache. Clara moved through her chores in a daze. Nayland watched her, her black eyes missing nothing, but said little. Clara's mind replayed his words. Not unless you ask me. The day bled into afternoon. The wind picked up, carrying the smell of snow. The hunters were late. as dusk began to settle, painting the snow-dusted peaks in shades of purple and gray. A cold knot of fear tightened in Clara's stomach. This was not the vague anxiety of waiting for food. This was a new, sharp, personal terror. This was for him. The other hunters returned, 2 of them, their faces grim. They carried a small deer, but they were alone. They said Dakota had followed a different track, a larger buck, heading east into the rocky draws. Clara did not wait. She did not ask permission. She ran to her mare, grabbing her heavy fur and a water skin. Nayland shouted at her, but Clara ignored her. She pulled herself onto the horse and kicked its flanks, sending it into a clumsy trot out of the camp, following the trail the men had pointed to. She rode for miles, the world fading into a cold, blue twilight. The pines were black shadows, the wind a high, mournful sound in their branches. She called his name until her throat was raw. "Dakota! Dakota!" She found him in a draw, half a mile from the main trail. He was not moving. She fell from the horse, stumbling through the ankle-deep snow. "Dakota!" He was on the ground, his back against a boulder. His face was pale, his skin clammy with sweat despite the freezing air. His leg. Her stomach turned. It was a trap, a settler's trap, a heavy, iron bear trap with cruel, rusted teeth. It was clamped shut on his lower leg, just above the ankle. The snow around it was dark with blood. The bone was clearly broken. "Clara," he whispered. His voice was a thin thread. "You came." "Who did this?" she cried, her hands fluttering over the vicious metal device. "Trapper, I did not see it," he grimaced, his body seized by a tremor of pain. "The chain, it is heavy." She saw it, a thick chain leading from the trap to a heavy log, half buried in the frozen ground. She pulled at the trap's jaws, her fingers numb, but the spring was too strong. She could not budge it. "Go," he gasped, his eyes closing. "Leave me. Get the others. It is too cold." "I am not leaving you," she said. Her voice was fierce, shaking. She looked at him, at the horse, at the trap. She could not get him on the horse with this terrible thing chained to the log. She pulled her skinning knife, the one Nayland had given her. She didn't try the trap again. She went to the log. She sawed and hacked at the frozen, half-buried links, using the knife as a lever, jamming it into the metal loops, twisting and pulling until her hands were raw and bleeding. Finally, with a snap of metal, the link holding the chain to the log broke free. The heavy trap was still on his leg, but now he was free from the log. "We have to go," she said. "You have to stand." "I cannot." "You will." She looped his arm over her shoulders, bracing herself. "Now." She hauled him up. He screamed, a raw, choked sound that was ripped from his throat as his weight came down. The broken bone grated. The trap's teeth bit deeper. He sagged against her, nearly unconscious, his entire weight crushing her. She was small, but the camp life had made her iron. She set her feet, gritting her teeth, and took his weight. He hopped on his good leg, the heavy iron trap and its length of chain dragging through the snow. It was miles, miles back in the dark, with the wind trying to peel the skin from their faces. He passed out twice. The first time, she slapped his face until he roused, his eyes wild. The second time, he would not wake. He was a dead weight. She tried to get him on the mare, but she could not lift him that high. So she dragged him. She looped his arms over her shoulders from behind, and she walked backwards, pulling him, his good heel and the iron trap carving 2 dark furrows in the snow. She sobbed with the effort, her muscles tearing, her lungs on fire. She fell, she got up, she pulled. She would not leave him. She dragged him into the camp like a prize won from the wilderness. She was near collapse, covered in his blood, her own hands frozen and bleeding, her face caked with frozen tears. The camp erupted. Healers rushed forward, carrying him into his lodge. They pried the rusted trap open, the sound of it releasing a sickening snap. They set the bone, binding it with splints. But the metal was foul. The wound was deep. By midnight, the fever came. He was delirious. He thrashed in the furs, his skin burning. He called out in his own language, his voice sharp with pain. He called for his mother. He called Kiala's name. Nalin and the other healers worked, applying poultices of herbs and chanting, but the fever only climbed. They pushed Clara aside, seeing her only as a useless, panicking white woman. She retreated to the darkest corner of the lodge, near the wall, and watched. In the deepest part of the night, the healers had to rest. They left, leaving one old woman to watch, who quickly fell asleep by the fire. He was shaking, his teeth chattering, but his skin was a furnace. He was slipping away. His breathing was shallow, a faint rattle. Clara felt a cold panic that was sharper than the wind. He could not die. Not now, not after everything. She crawled to his side. "Dakota," she whispered. He did not respond. She dipped a cloth in the cold water bucket and bathed his face, his neck. "It's all right," she said. "I am here." He groaned, his head tossing, lost in the fever dream. She had to anchor him. She had to keep him from drifting away. "Listen to me," she said, her voice stronger, desperate. She took his hot, dry hand in her own. "You have to stay. Do you hear me? Stay." She needed to hold him here with her. She had nothing else, only her voice. I will tell you a story," she said, her voice thick and unsteady. "My mother, she used to read to me from a book. It was a green book." She whispered, her voice filling the small, dark, smoky lodge. She told him about a place called Boston, about cobblestone streets and ships with tall masts. She told him about the smell of the sea. She told him about the house she had lived in, with a rose bush by the window. She told him about a small, fat dog named Samuel, who had chased chickens. She told him about the taste of an apple pie her mother had made, with cinnamon. Her voice grew hoarse. She whispered nonsense, fragments of memory, children's rhymes, the plots of stories she barely remembered. She held his hand. She bathed his face. When his lips parted, she forced sips of water between them. She did not stop. She talked all night, her voice a low, steady thread in the dark. She was whispering to keep him from the silence. She was whispering to keep the shadows from taking him. Just before the gray light of dawn touched the smoke hole, the violent shaking stopped. His body went lax. She felt the terrible heat begin to wreck it from his skin. His breathing, which had been so shallow, deepened. It became the slow, even breath of true sleep. The fever had broken. Clara did not move. She was utterly spent, her body aching with a fatigue so deep it was a pain. She laid her head down on the edge of his bedroll, her frozen fingers still tangled with his. She watched the faint, peaceful rise and fall of his chest in the pale light, and only then, certain he would stay, did she allow herself to close her eyes. Dakota did not die. He recovered with the stubborn, slow tenacity of the mountain plants. The fever left him hollow-eyed and weak, but the iron will that had kept him alive in the trap now turned toward healing. The healers had set the bone, but it was Nalin who diagnosed the deeper problem. The teeth of the trap were rusted. The wound, though clean, was poisoned by the iron. Clara, who had been pushed aside, was now summoned. Nalin, her face like carved hickory, pointed at the wound. "White man's iron," she said in the Apache tongue, white woman's knowledge. Clara did not have knowledge, but she had memory. She remembered her uncle treating a horse that had stepped on a rusted nail. She asked for salt. She asked for the hottest, cleanest water. For 3 days. She did not sleep. She boiled bandages. She soaked the angry, inflamed wound in brine so hot it made Dakota clench his fists. She packed it with the poultice Nalin made from yucca root, but it was the salt and the boiling water, her only defenses, that she trusted. He watched her. His delirium was gone, replaced by a quiet, lucid intensity. He watched her tear her own petticoat into clean strips. He watched her move about the small lodge, her face set in a mask of concentration, her hands gentle but firm. Nalin watched her, too. The old woman saw the way Dakota's eyes followed the white woman. She saw the way Clara's hand lingered on his forehead. She saw the intimacy that had been forged in the fever, an unspoken thing that was now as real and solid as the rock walls outside. Nalin stopped referring to Clara as the woman. She began, gruffly, to use her name. In 2 weeks, Dakota could sit up. In 3, he was standing, leaning heavily on a carved stick. The wound had closed, leaving a puckered, angry scar. He would walk with a limp for the rest of his life. The trap had taken his speed, but it had given him something else. The emotional wall between them, the shame and the uncertainty, had been burned away by the fever. The distance he had so fiercely maintained was gone. He still slept in his separate bedroll, but the space was no longer empty. It was charged. He watched her. He had always watched her. But now it was different. Before, it was the gaze of a wary guardian. Now, it was the look of a man. It was a raw, aching longing that he made no effort to hide. He watched her grind corn, his eyes tracing the line of her neck, the curve of her back. He watched her mend his moccasin, his gaze fixed on her fingers, remembering their touch. But he held back. He had given her his word. He had nearly broken it, driven by a hunger that had terrified him. He had seen the fear in her eyes. He would not, could not, be the beast. He had given her the choice, and he would honor it, even if the waiting was a kind of agony. Clara felt his gaze like a physical touch. It was a heat on her skin. She was no longer afraid of him. She had seen him at his most vulnerable, a broken man whispering for his mother. She had dragged him through the snow. She had held him to life with her voice. He was no longer a stranger, no longer her captor. He was hers. He was the man she had saved. And she, who had never known desire, was beginning to understand it. It was not the crude fumbling she had witnessed in Silas's saloon. It was this quiet, breathless waiting, this simmering heat in a cold lodge, this deep, unspoken recognition. The nights were the hardest. The cold was a physical presence, a bitter enemy. They lay 6 feet apart, 2 separate islands of warmth, both wide awake, listening to the sound of the other's breathing in the dark. One night, the cold was a blade. A fresh snow had fallen, and the wind drove the temperature down so far that the very air seemed to crackle. Clara lay in her furs, shivering so deeply she felt her bones would come apart. She was curled in a tight ball, but it was no use. The cold was winning. She looked across the darkness. She could see the faint outline of Dakota. He was on his back, his body rigid. He was not asleep. She knew he was as cold as she was. She knew he was waiting. He would not cross that space. His pride, his promise, would keep him there until he froze. She remembered his words. Not unless you ask me. She had been given the choice. Now, she would make it. She sat up. The movement was loud in the silence. She heard Dakota's breath catch. He did not move. Clara stood, a pale shape in the moonlight that filtered through the smoke hole. She left her own furs behind and walked the few steps to his bedroll. She knelt beside him. He was staring up at her, his eyes black and wide, his face a mask of disbelief and a desperate, fragile hope. She did not need a story. She did not need a grand speech. She leaned down, her hair falling to curtain her face. He flinched, as if expecting a blow, or perhaps a word of kindness she did not know how to give. She kissed him. It was slow. It was deliberate. It held none of the hesitant reverence of his first kiss, and none of the panicked hunger of his second. This was a statement. This was her answer. She felt a tremor run through his entire body, a deep, shuddering sigh. His hands, which had been clenched at his sides, rose. They did not grab her. They settled on her shoulders, his grip uncertain. She pulled back, just an inch, and looked down at him. His face was awash in confusion, in a raw, vulnerable wanting. "I'm asking," she whispered. The words broke him. A sound, half sob, half groan, tore from his chest. His control, the iron wall he had built, shattered. He pulled her down, his mouth finding hers in the dark. And it was not a kiss of reverence. It was a kiss of starvation. But the moment the hunger took him, the moment his grip tightened, he froze again. He pulled back, his eyes frantic. "Clara, I will hurt you. I do not know." "You won't," she whispered. "I am not afraid." He looked at her, searching her face, and saw the truth of it. She was not afraid, not of him. What followed was not the brutal, painful assault she had braced herself for her entire life. It was not the clumsy, drunken taking of a man like Silas. It was sacred. His hands, when they went to the ties of her worn calico dress, were trembling. His fingers were rough and calloused, but his touch was so light, so hesitant, it was almost painful. He fumbled with the simple knot, his breathing ragged. She had to lift her hands and guide his. He undressed her with an agonizing slowness. Each touch was a question. He slid the dress from her shoulders, and his fingers brushed the skin of her collarbone. He stopped, his eyes closing, as if the contact was too much to bear. He touched her hair, her face, her shoulders, his hands learning her in the dark. It was not the touch of a man claiming property. It was the touch of a blind man seeing for the first time. It was full of wonder and an aching, desperate restraint. When she was bare, she shivered, and he pulled her deep into the warmth of his bedroll. His own skin burning against hers, he held her, just held her, his face buried in her hair. She felt something wet and hot on her shoulder. She pulled back, shocked. In the pale moonlight, she saw the tears streaming down his face. This warrior, this man who had faced traps and enemies, was weeping. He was weeping from the sheer, overwhelming terror and beauty of her being there. "You are here," he choked out. "I am here," she said. When he moved over her, he was clumsy, hesitant, and in that moment, she understood. The knowledge struck her with the force of a physical blow. The rejection by Kiala, his shame, his fear of being soft, his distance. He was a virgin. Her uncle had sold her to a virgin, a man who had never known a woman, who had been raised to revere the act, to see it as a sacred thing, not a right to be taken. All her fear, all her life's expectations, dissolved into a profound, breathless awe. She, who had expected only pain, was now the one in control. She was the one with the knowledge. "It's all right," she whispered. Her voice was steady, her heart full of a tenderness she had never known she possessed. She wrapped her arms around his shaking shoulders, pulling him close. "I am here." She guided him, gently, patiently. There was pain, a brief, sharp tearing, but it was so insignificant, so completely overshadowed by the emotional weight of the moment, that it barely registered. It was eclipsed by his gasp, by the feel of his tears on her skin, by the way he clung to her as if she were his only anchor in a storm. The act itself was not an act of possession. It was an act of discovery. It was a final, shattering confession. It was the joining of two wounds. Afterward, they lay tangled in the furs, their limbs entwined, their bodies slick with sweat. The silence in the lodge was total. Neither of them could speak. There were no words for what had happened. Clara lay with her head on his chest, listening to the heavy, slowing beat of his heart. She was whole. She was not broken. She was not shamed. She realized, with a sudden, sharp clarity, that her breath was stolen. It had been caught in her throat for the last hour, but it was not stolen by fear. or by pain. It was stolen by awe. The days that followed were a quiet revelation. The camp saw the change. Clara no longer slept in her separate furs. She woke in Dakota's bedroll, in his arms. The shame was gone from his face, replaced by a quiet, stunned joy. He limped beside her, no longer her guardian, but her partner. Their intimacy deepened in small, unspoken ways. He would be carving a new arrow shaft by the fire, and she would bring him a cup of broth. His hand would cover hers, his thumb rubbing the calluses, and they would sit in silence, content. She would be scraping a hide, her arms aching, and he would come and stand behind her, his presence a shield against the curious stares, his hand resting lightly on her back. He began to tease her. Her Apache was still clumsy, her pronunciation thick. She once asked Nalin for beso, money, when she meant Abe, milk. Dakota had overheard, and now, when she looked at him with a serious face, he would whisper, money, and the rare, bright flash of his smile would undo her. And he listened. The stories she had whispered to him in his fever, he now asked to hear again, in the quiet of their lodge. She told him about Boston, about the Green Book, about her mother. He listened with an intensity that showed he was not just hearing words. He was memorizing the pieces of her soul. In turn, he taught her. He was still lame, unable to hunt. So he taught her. He took her to a sheltered grove and gave her a small, sinew-backed bow, built for a youth. You must be strong, he said. Not just, here, he touched her arm. Here, he touched her heart. Her fingers were raw. The string bit into her skin. Her arms ached, but she learned. She learned to stand, to breathe, to release. He would stand behind her, his arms enclosing hers, his hand on her elbow, guiding the draw. Quiet, he would murmur in her ear, his breath warm. Be the wind, then the stone. One afternoon, sitting in the weak winter sun, she took a piece of charcoal from the fire. She found a flat, pale stone. He watched, curious, as she carefully, slowly, drew a shape. See. She looked at him. This is my sound. She drew the next L-A-R-A. Clara, he said, touching the stone. This is my name, she said. My mark. He took the charcoal from her. His large, scarred hand was clumsy, but he concentrated. His tongue caught between his teeth, just as she did with the bow. He drew the shapes. C-L-A-R-A. He looked at it, then at her, and a slow, proud smile spread across his face. He had learned her. He had claimed her in a way his tribe, his body, his language never could. He had learned her mark. The quiet peace of their new world was not meant to last. It was a fragile thing, a warm breath in a frozen world. The trouble started, as it always did, with the scouts. They returned not from a hunt, but from a patrol, their faces hard. They had seen them. Not soldiers, a caravan. 3 white-topped wagons, moving slow, struggling north through the foothills, miles to the east. But following the same river, they were settlers, and they were close. The news hit the camp like a thrown stone. The fragile security of the high valley was shattered. Tensions, which had been buried by the snow and the new intimacy, rose to the surface. The anger turned, as it had before, to the outsider, to the white woman. Zako, his limp more pronounced than Dakota's, his face twisted with malice, spoke openly by the fire. She is their beacon, he said, his voice loud enough for all to hear. She is their scout. She brought them here. She is a poison. This time, the accusation stuck. The settlers were not a rumor. They were there. Clara felt the stares. The women who had begun to share food with her now turned away. The children who had touched her pale hair now ran. She was the cause. She was the weakness in their defenses. Her presence was a betrayal. That night, the lodge was silent again, but it was the old silence, the one of fear and tension. Clara could not eat. She watched Dakota cleaning his rifle, his face grim. "They are right," she whispered, her voice so low he barely heard her. He did not look up. "No." "Yes," she insisted, her voice gaining a desperate strength. "I am white. They see me. They follow. Your people, they will be hurt because of me." She stood up, her hands clenched. She walked to him, kneeling in front of him, forcing him to look at her. "You must send me away. Dakota, before they find us." "Send you where?" he asked, his voice flat. "To them? To freeze in the snow. You are my wife." "I am your danger," she cried. If you care for me, you will let me go. I will walk to them. I will tell them you are not here. I will do something, but I cannot be the one who brings the fire. I cannot." She was begging him, the tears she had not shed in the fever now streaming down her face. She was begging him to save his people from her. He set the rifle down. He looked at her panicked, pleading face. He saw her sacrifice. He saw the love that was driving her to leave him. He reached out and gripped her chin, his hold firm, forcing her to be still. His eyes were black and fierce, not with anger, but with a terrible, absolute certainty. "I did not save you," he said, his voice a low growl. "I did not lie to my elders. I did not make you my heart, only to send you away when I am afraid." He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. "You are not my weakness, Clara," he said, his voice raw with conviction. "You are my choice." His words, "You are my choice," were a shield. But a shield cannot stop an avalanche. It can only hold for a moment before it is buried. The attack came 3 days later. At the gray, cold hour before dawn, there was no warning. There was no demand for surrender. There was only the sudden, flat crack of a rifle from the ridge, followed by a human scream. The camp exploded from sleep into chaos. Men scrambled for weapons. Women grabbed for children. The air, which had been still and fried, was suddenly filled with the thunder of hooves, the shouts of white men, and the smell of fire. A volley of shots tore through the lodges. Clara scrambled from their furs, her heart seizing in her chest. "Dakota!" He was already moving, his rifle in his hand, his bad leg dragging. "Stay down," he roared at her. "To the rocks." He limped out into the firefight. She saw him take cover, his rifle barking in reply. But the attackers were not trying to take the camp. They were trying to destroy it. A flaming brand arced through the air, landing on the winter store of dried meat and hides. It went up in a sickening whoosh of grease and smoke. They were burning the food. "The children!" Nayland's voice, a high-pitched shriek of terror. "Where are the children?" Clara saw them. 3 small children, no older than 5, huddled together near the central fire pit, paralyzed by fear. A rider, his face shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat, was bearing down on them. Clara did not think. She ran. She scooped up the smallest child, Nayland's granddaughter, and shoved the other 2. "Run, Cad!" she screamed, using one of the few words she knew. "Now!" She remembered a place, a fissure in the rock wall, high up where she had been gathering herbs. It was barely a cave, a dark split in the stone. She pushed them toward it, her body shielding them. Another shot kicked up snow at her feet. She did not stop. She shoved them into the darkness. "Stay here," she commanded, her voice fierce. "Do not make a sound." She turned back. The camp was a nightmare. The settlers, at least 20 of them, were riding through, setting fire to the lodges, shooting at anyone who moved. She saw Cochinet, the old elder, step out, his hands raised, his voice calling for peace. A rifle shot from the ridge cracked, and he crumpled to the ground, a dark stain spreading on his chest. Clara fell back against the rock, her hand over her mouth, stifling her own scream. This was not a battle. This was a massacre. It was over as quickly as it began. The riders swept through, their work done, and were gone, melting back into the gray dawn. They left silence, the smell of burning, and the sound of wailing. Clara coaxed the children out. They were safe. She had saved them. But the camp was lost. Cochine was dead. 2 other women had been shot. The winter stores, everything they needed to survive the high country cold, were a smoking, ruined pile. Dakota found her by the rocks. His face was a mask of cold, black rage. He was not hurt. He limped to her, his eyes not on her, but on the body of Cochine. "They burned the hunting grounds," he said, his voice flat. "Dead. All the low valleys. Smoke for miles." He turned and limped to the surviving warriors. There were 5 of them. Zako was one, his face a mixture of terror and fury. Dakota spoke, his voice no longer the quiet, hesitant one she knew. It was the voice of a war chief. He spoke in Apache, his words fast and sharp as flint. He was not asking, he was commanding. They were going for revenge. He went to their lodge, the only one that had not been set alight. He strapped his splinted leg, his movements quick and vicious. He took his knife. He took his rifle and a belt of ammunition. He looked at her, and his eyes were holes. There was no love in them, no fear, only a vast, cold emptiness. He looked at her as if he was already a ghost. He turned and left. Clara watched him mount his horse and lead the 5 men out of the canyon at a hard gallop. The wailing of the women was the only sound. Nayland was rocking over the body of Cochine, her song a thin, heartbreaking keen. Clara's hands were shaking so hard she could not clench them. But there was work. She went to the woman who had been shot in the arm. She found Nayland's bag of herbs. She tore strips from her own dress. She set water to boil. She worked. She cleaned the wounds. She saw the brutality firsthand, the ragged hole in the woman's shoulder, the way the child's leg had been crushed by a horse. She saw the dead. She looked at Cochine, his eyes open to the sky, and she felt the hot acid bile of hatred rise in her throat. She had saved 3 children, but she had brought this. Zako was right. She was the poison. They waited all that day and into the night. Every whisper of the wind was the sound of riders. Every shadow was a new attack. They returned just before the next dawn. 4 men rode in, not 5. One was slumped over his horse, held there by another. Dakota was at the head. He was covered in blood. It was caked on his chest, on his arms, on his face. It was not his. He was not wounded, no more than he had been, but he was hollowed out. He slid from his horse, his bad leg buckling. He did not look at anyone. He stared at the ground as the women began to wail for the warrior who had not come back, and for the one who had come back dead. Clara went to him. He was standing by his horse, his hands stained dark red, clenched on the saddle. "Dakota," she whispered. He did not answer. He looked through her. He was not there. The man she knew, the one who had wept in her arms, was gone. This was the warrior he had fought to become, a killer. He stumbled toward their lodge. She followed. He sat on the bedroll. He just sat, staring at the brush wall, his rifle still in his grip. Clara's hands were shaking. She could not stop them. She went to the water bucket. It was a simple, domestic act. She brought the bucket and a cloth. She knelt in front of him. She dipped the cloth in the icy water and wrung it out. Her hands were trembling, splashing water on the dirt floor. She reached up and touched his face. He flinched, his eyes snapping to hers, and for a second, she saw a wild, cornered animal. "It is me," she whispered. He did not move. He let her. She washed the blood from his face. She washed it from his neck, from his chest, from his arms. She had to unfold his fingers, one by one, to wash the caked, drying blood from his palms and from under his nails. He was a statue of cold flesh. He did not speak. He did not blink. He only breathed, his breath shallow and fast. When she was done, the water in the bucket was dark red. She set it aside. She sat in front of him. The silence was terrible. Night came. The camp was a place of mourning. The tribe was broken. They were starving. They were defeated, and the pass was filled with their dead. She brought him broth. He would not take it. She lay down in the furs beside him. He was still sitting up, bolt upright, staring at nothing. She waited. Hours passed. The fire burned down to a single, pulsing red coal. She could not bear the silence. She could not bear his emptiness. She moved, sitting up, and put her arms around him from behind. She pressed her face to his back. His whole body went rigid. A violent tremor ran through him. "It is done," she whispered, her voice thick. "It is done. You are home." A sound was torn from his throat. It was not a word. It was a sound of pure, undiluted agony. He turned, his body collapsing. He buried his face against her shoulder, his hands clutching her, his knuckles digging into her back. He shattered. He did not make a sound. There were no tears, no sobs, just a silent, violent shaking, as if his soul was trying to tear itself from his body. He shuddered in her arms, his breath catching in harsh, dry gasps. He was breaking apart, and he was doing it in silence. Clara just held him. She held him as he had held her. She was his anchor. She held the pieces of the man who had gone out, and the killer who had come back. The next day, the council met. It was not a council. It was a gathering of survivors. The mood was not angry. It was dead. Zako spoke. His voice was hollow, without his usual malice. It was just factual. "They came for her. They will come again. They burned our food. They killed our elder. We cannot fight them. We cannot feed our children." He looked at Dakota, who sat beside Clara, his face pale and empty. "He chose her. He brought this war. He defied the council. He defied the spirits." Naylin stood. Her eyes were red from weeping, but her voice was steady. "We are a people," she said. "We cannot die here. The choice is hard, but it is the only one. They will not stop while she is here." She looked at Dakota. "Or while he is here. He has taken their blood. They will hunt him." The vote was not a vote. It was a quiet, terrible consensus. Banishment. To save the tribe, they must both go. Clara stood. Her voice did not shake. "No, just me. I will go. I will go to them. Let Dakota stay. You need him. He is a warrior. He can protect you." She was offering herself. Dakota slowly, painfully, pulled himself to his feet. He leaned on his stick. He looked at Nalin, at Zako, at the faces of the people he had known his entire life. They would not meet his eyes. He turned to Clara. He did not speak. He simply reached out and took the small pack of supplies she had been holding. He went into their lodge. "We pack," he said. His choice was exile. They left at dawn. Naylin pressed a small pouch into Clara's hand. It was dried meat, a gift of pity, a gift of love. "Go north," she whispered. "High, where they cannot follow. May the spirits guide you." They had 2 horses, 1 small pack of food, enough for 3 days. If they were careful. 2 bedrolls. They rode out of the canyon, not looking back. The silence from the camp was absolute. No one watched them go. They rode north, climbing into the high, cold mountain passes. The wind was a constant knife, peeling the warmth from their skin. They did not speak. There was nothing to say. They were 2 people, alone, in a vast, white, and killing world. On the second day, the sky turned a flat, bruised gray. The wind, which had been a steady howl, died to a sinister whisper. "Snow," Dakota said. It was the first word he had spoken in hours. It did not come gently. It came as a wall, a solid roaring curtain of white that erased the world. The wind hit them like a fist, a deafening shriek that stole their breath. "This way!" Dakota shouted, grabbing the bridle of her horse. But there was no way, there was no trail. There was only the blinding, suffocating white. The horses stumbled, whining in terror. They were lost. They were going to die here, frozen, 20 paces from each other, unable to see. "Here!" His voice was a raw shout. He had seen it, a black stain in the white, a hole in the side of the mountain. He half fell from his horse, pulling her down. He dragged her toward it. It was a collapsed mine shaft. Old timbers, rotted and black, marked an entrance. They stumbled inside, out of the screaming wind, dragging the terrified horses to huddle at the mouth. The shelter was dark. It smelled of rust, of wet stone, of dead air, but it was out of the wind. The blizzard howled. It was a living, malicious thing, trying to tear the mountain apart. They knew they could not move. They would wait. They huddled together, wrapping both bedrolls around them, their bodies pressed together for warmth. The horses stamped and snorted at the entrance, their large bodies a final, fragile barrier against the storm. A day passed. The wind did not stop. They ate a strip of the dried meat, their jaws aching with the effort of chewing. They did not speak. A second day. The wind howled. The world was white. "Tell me." Dakota's voice was a dry rasp in the dark. "About the Green Book." She talked. Her voice was thin, small against the roar of the wind. She told him about Boston, about the sea, about her mother's hands. She told him stories to keep the darkness at bay. He told her of his first hunt, how his hands had shaken so badly he had missed the deer, how his father had not been angry, but had simply shown him how to breathe. They shared memories, small, flickering embers of a life that was gone. On the third morning, the wind finally quieted, but the cold was a different thing now. It was a deep, penetrating, absolute cold that seemed to come from the stone itself. Their food was gone. Their fire, a few twigs Dakota had found, had died. Clara tried to stand. Her legs would not hold her. She had no strength left. The hunger, the cold, the despair. It had finally taken her. "I am so tired. Dakota," she whispered. Her eyelids were heavy. She was not afraid. She was just empty. She sank to the floor of the mine, her body limp. "I need to sleep." "No!" His voice was sharp, panicked. "Clara, stay! Look at me!" He shook her. Her head lolled. Her eyes were closed. "No," he whispered. He scrambled, his bad leg twisting under him. He saw her slipping away. He had lost his people, his home. He would not lose her. He dragged her to the mouth of the mine. He clawed at the deep snow with his bare hands, filling his small tin cup. He used his bow drill, his hands shaking, his movements frantic, until a tiny spark caught on the dried moss he carried. He made a tiny flame, melting the snow. He lifted her head, forcing the few drops of water between her lips. "Stay," he pleaded. Stay with me." He rubbed her hands, her feet, his own fingers numb. He pulled her against his chest, trying to force his own failing warmth into her. It was not enough. He began to sing, a high, wailing, desperate sound, an old chant of his people, a song to the Dian, the spirits of the mountain, begging them to spare her, to not take her. She woke to the sound of his voice. It was not singing, it was sobbing. He was clutching her hand, his face pressed to her frozen fingers. His body was shaking. "No," he was weeping. "No, do not leave me. I am nothing. Do not leave, please." She lifted her other hand. It was so heavy. She touched his hair. "I am here." He snapped his head up. His face was a ruin of terror, relief, and a wild, desperate hunger. He looked at her open eyes, and he lunged. His mouth crushed hers. It was not a kiss, it was a bite. It was a desperate, wild, unrestrained claiming. It was the kiss of a man who had just seen her die and return. It was full of teeth and the salt of his tears. He pulled her to him, his hands tearing at the furs, at the ties of her clothes. She did not stop him. She met his hunger with her own. This was not the sacred awe of their first time. This was not the reverent, gentle discovery. This was fierce. This was hungry. This was a rebellion. They were two starving, freezing, banished animals in a cage of ice. The world was trying to kill them. He was not asking. She was not guiding. They were claiming each other. They were fighting back the only way they could. They made love in the frozen dark, under the high, thin howl of the wind. It was not soft. It was a desperate, powerful, and ferocious act of life. The blizzard that had tried to bury them was the same storm that sealed their bond. When the howling stopped and the wall of white receded from the mine's entrance, they crawled out into a world scoured and silent. They were no longer two separate, wounded people. They were one. The fierce, desperate act in the dark had burned away the last of their old lives. There was no more Clara, the captive. There was no more Dakota, the shamed warrior. There was only us. They were starving. The horses, their ribs stark beneath their shaggy coats, had survived by eating the bark from the frozen timbers. Dakota, his face gaunt, his limp a heavy, dragging pain, found a single, scrawny rabbit in one of his snares. They ate it raw, their hands too numb, their need too great to fumble with the bow drill for a fire. Spring came not as a gentle green thaw, but as a violent, muddy flood. The high passes became treacherous rivers of melting snow and rock. They were weak, but they moved, following the water down, always down, away from the killing cold of the peaks. They ate roots Clara dug from the mud, and small, thin fish Dakota speared with a sharpened stick. They were two ghosts, limping side by side. Their silence no longer heavy with unspoken words, but light with a complete, shared understanding. They found the trading post in a low, sheltered valley, where the stream widened into a creek. It was a ruin, a monument to some other man's failed dream. It was built of stone and timber, but the roof had fallen in, and one wall was a black, charred scar. A fire had taken it, long ago. To Clara, it was a palace. "Here," she said, her voice a dry croak. Dakota looked at the ruin. He saw the broken walls, the vulnerability. Then he looked at her, at the raw determination in her eyes. He nodded. "Here," he agreed. They set to work. It was a slow, agonizing rebuilding. Dakota, with his ruined leg, could no longer climb or run, but his hands were strong, and his mind was sharp. He taught her how to mix mud and straw, how to daub the stones. He sat, his back against a pine, and directed her as she, her muscles thin but wiry, climbed the walls to reset the timbers he had salvaged. He could not hunt the deer, but he was a master of the trap. He brought rabbits, grouse, and a beaver from the creek, its pelt thick and rich. Clara, in turn, worked the earth. Inside the burned-out shell, she found a rusted spade head. She fixed it to a stick, and in a rotted corner, she found a small, half-rotted canvas sack. At the bottom, rattling like tiny stones, was a miracle, a handful of dried beans. She cleared a patch of ground by the creek, the richest soil she could find. She planted them, one by one, pushing each bean into the cold, damp earth with her thumb. It was an act of faith, a prayer for a life they had not yet earned. They fell into a rhythm. Their days were measured by work, their nights by the shared warmth of their bedroll inside the slowly mending walls. The intimacy that had been born in desperation now became a quiet domesticity. It was in the way she would bring him water, wordlessly. When she saw the sweat on his brow, it was in the way he would leave a rare, sweet root he had found on the stump they used as a table. A silent offering. There was no more shame, no more uncertainty. He was her hands, and she was his legs. One day in early summer, a rider appeared on the ridge. Dakota saw him first. He was on his feet in an instant, his knife in his hand, his rifle by the door. Clara grabbed her own rifle. They were a single, bristling unit. The rider was not white. He was Indian, but not Apache. He was older, with long braids wrapped in otter fur. And he rode a fine pony. He raised his hand, palm out. "I trade," he called, his voice deep. He was Blackfoot, a man who walked between worlds, a trader named Joseph Manycoats. He had heard whispers of a new, small settlement, but this was not what he expected. He saw the Apache warrior, lame but fierce, and the pale, slender white woman who stood beside him, not behind him, holding her rifle with an easy confidence. "He is my husband," Clara said, her voice clear and steady. The words hung in the warm summer air. Joseph Manycoats, a man who had seen everything, was visibly surprised. He lowered his hand and grunted, a sound of respect. He had seen captives. He had seen slaves. This was neither. This was something new. He had salt, he had flour, he had steel needles. They had a stack of prime, well-cured rabbit and beaver pelts. They traded. He stayed for 2 nights, sharing their fire. He was a gossip, a newsbringer. He told them the cavalry was far south, fighting the Comanche. He told them the world was quiet. For now, he was curious about them. His black eyes missing nothing, the shared cup, the way Dakota's gaze softened when he looked at her. When he left, he carried their pelts and their story. Word spread, carried by men like Joseph, to the lonely forts and trading posts, the story of the white woman and the Apache outlaw, living as man and wife in a rebuilt ruin in the high hills. They had become a piece of the land's folklore. Joseph returned in the late summer, when the beans were heavy on the vine. He brought more goods, but he also brought a letter. It was crumpled, stained, and had passed through many hands. It had come from a magistrate in Last Chance, addressed to the owner of the trading post Joseph used as a base, asking if anyone had news of Silas Croft's niece. Clara took it with a trembling hand. She sat on the stone stoop they had built, her heart a cold stone. Dakota sat beside her, his presence a warm, solid wall. She read. Silas was dead. He had died in his own filth, his liver rotted from drink. Months ago, not long after she had been taken, his few pathetic belongings had been sold to clear his gambling debts. The letter was an official notice, clearing the last of his affairs. It mentioned her, Clara, believed deceased or captive among the Apache, and declared her legally free of any claim or debt. Her name was clear. She was no one's property. She was free. She let the paper fall into her lap. Free. The word was strange. She had been free, truly free, only since she had been banished. That night, the fire burned low. Dakota was watching her. The letter was on the table, a pale square in the shadows. "You can go," he said. His voice was flat, carefully empty. She looked at him. "Go where?" "To them," he said. He gestured south, toward the world of men like Silas. "Last Chance, or Boston, where the Green Book is. Your name is clear. You are safe now, with your people." He was offering her the world. He was offering her an escape from the outlaw, the Apache, the hard life she lived. He was offering to break his own heart if it meant her safety. She stood up. She walked to him, and he looked up at her, his face a mask of iron control, his eyes a pit of aching loss. Clara took his face in her hands. She felt the rough, scarred skin of his jaw, the warmth of his breath. She made him look at her. "I am not going anywhere," she whispered. "You are safe," he argued, his voice breaking. "A white woman." "I was never safe with them," she said, her voice fierce, cutting him off. "I was property. I was a trade. I was a debt. I was never safe." She pressed her forehead to his. "Safe is this, safe is the blizzard, safe is you." She pulled back, her hands still framing his face, her thumbs brushing the high, proud line of his cheekbones. "I am already home," she said. The next day, she went to him while he was checking his snares. "I am not your captive," she said. "I am not your trade. I am not the woman you saved. I am your wife." He looked at her, confused. "I know this." "I want a mark," she said. "I want a sign." He understood. They had no church. They had no laws but their own. So they would make their own mark. He worked for 2 days. He took a piece of deer bone, dried and white, left from a kill they had made. He sat for hours, his bad legs stretched out, his hands, so large and scarred, moving with a delicate, patient grace. He carved. He made 2 rings. They were simple, pale bands, polished smooth with sand from the creek. They walked to the small meadow above the post, the one that was full of late summer wildflowers, blue and yellow and white. The sun was warm, the sky a deep, aching blue. They stood facing each other. There was no one but the hawks circling overhead and the wind in the pines. He took her hand. He slid the pale ring onto her finger. He spoke in Apache, his voice low and solemn, a vow to the Diin, the spirits, to the earth, to the sky, and to her. He called her Shike, my kinswoman, Shiatsa, my wife, Shini, my heart. Then she took his hand, his rough, scarred hand, and slid the matching ring onto his finger. She spoke in English, her voice clear and strong in the high, clean air. "I was no one," she said. "You made me someone. I was lost. You are my home, by the sun and the earth and my own heart. I am your wife." They stood in the meadow, married. The test of that marriage came in the first cold snap of autumn. A man and a woman stumbled into their valley. They were skeletons, hollow-eyed, their clothes in tatters. The man, Amos, was carrying a heavy, useless rifle. The woman, Sarah, was leaning on him, her breath a thin wheeze. They were settlers, their wagon broken, their ox dead, lost for a week. They saw the cabin. Then they saw Dakota, who had been splitting wood. Amos raised his rifle, his hands shaking with weakness. "Get back, Injun!" he hissed. I'll shoot." Dakota did not move. He just watched them, his face impassive, his axe in his hand. He had heard those words his entire life. Clara stepped out of the cabin, her own rifle in her hand. "He said, 'Put it down,'" she said. Her voice was cold. The couple stared, their minds unable to process what they were seeing. A white woman, in a buckskin dress, her hair in a long braid, standing with an Apache. "Please," the woman, Sarah, whispered, and she collapsed in the dirt. The tension broke. Clara set her rifle aside. "Get her inside," she ordered Amos. "To Dakota," she said. "Broth and water." They worked together, the silent, efficient team they had become. Clara and Dakota moved around the terrified, suspicious couple. They fed them. They gave them warm furs. They did not ask questions. They did not offer judgment. Amos sat by the fire, his eyes darting from Dakota to Clara, his rifle never leaving his lap. He could not understand. Sarah, however, just wept with gratitude, holding the warm cup of broth in her trembling hands. They stayed for 3 days until their strength returned. Amos watched Dakota, the outlaw, bind a new splint on his own lame leg. He watched Clara, the captive, speak to her husband in a mix of soft English and guttural Apache, and he saw them laugh quietly. When they left, Dakota gave Amos a small sack of jerky. He took the man's map and, with a piece of charcoal, drew a clear, new line. "The pass," he said, pointing. "Safe. No. Deep snow." Amos looked at the map, at the jerky, at the two people standing on their stone stoop. We got no money," he stammered. "Go," Clara said, "and do not come back." They watched them disappear over the ridge. They had faced the world that had banished them both, and they had chosen grace. Months passed. The seasons turned. The high valley was theirs. The snows came again, but this time they were not a terror. They were a blessing. The small cabin was warm, the walls thick, the roof sound. The chimney drew well. Their small root cellar was stocked with dried beans from Clara's harvest, with smoked meat from Dakota's traps, with dried herbs and berries. They were not just surviving. They were living. The fear was gone. The world was far away. The war was over. The story closes on a quiet night, deep in the heart of that peaceful winter. A good fire of pinon pine burned in the hearth, filling the small room with warmth and the scent of incense. Clara sat on a low stool, her back against the warm stones. She was reading. It was a tattered, water-damaged book of poems she had found in the ruin, and she spoke the words softly, her voice the only sound. Dakota sat across from her, his lame legs stretched out. He was carving. His hands, which she knew held such strength, moved with a loving, patient gentleness. He was carving a small, smooth piece of cottonwood. It was a bird, its wings half spread. It was a toy. It was a prayer for a child they hoped would come, a child that might, she suspected, already be a quiet promise inside her. He finished a cut, and he looked up, his eyes finding hers in the firelight. He smiled. It was not the rare, bright, painful smile of his youth. It was a deep, steady smile of a man who is content, a man who is home. Clara's breath caught in her throat. It was not the sharp gasp of awe from their first night, nor the terror of the raid, nor the desperation of the mine. It was a soft, quiet catch. He still looked at her. After all this time, after the trade, the blood, the fever, the war, the blizzard, as if he was seeing her for the first time. Thank you so much for listening to this story. We would be truly grateful if you would let us know where you are listening from in the comments. Please subscribe to From Wild West, and we would love to hear your thoughts on Clara and Dakota's journey, in English, in the comments below.